For lack of a better term, we were forced into a remote work experiment about 5 years ago today.
Why did you call hybrid work a quick fix?
Yeah, so what I found was, and so you're seeing a lot of just confusion in general in terms of implementation, and that's leading to...
I guess that there's no perfect solution for that. You need then to look at what's happening in the company and try to design something that would work.
So what we actually have found is that, when we're looking at remote and return to office as kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, there's so much space in between.
I haven't yet found an answer for this, but I don't understand how these learnings that I just mentioned exist with remote work.
Yeah, I know, and that's the big question mark.
But then the pandemic stopped and we started seeing those move back to the office movements. What happened, Kay? If everything was working, why did companies started to ask people to come back?
It's a control issue.
What's your bet for the next years? Will remote work continue to shrink?
If people take nothing else away from this conversation, they have to remember that remote and return to office, it's a false binary, it's a false choice, because...
Hello, Kay.
Hi, João.
Thank you for joining the show.
Really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Kay, I would like to give an introduction about what I found on your profiles and to share with our viewers. So you present yourself as someone that is helping leaders optimize global, remote, and hybrid teams with more than 11 years of experience advising leaders in more than 47 countries. And you also have a podcast that you call Inclusion in Progress. Okay. Yeah. So very, very interesting topics. Is this a good summary of the challenge that you're facing right now, or would you like to add anything else that I forgot?
That makes me sound very cool, João. Thank you for that. But yeah, happy to build upon that. So as you said, my name is Kay Fabella. I run Inclusion in Progress. It's a consulting firm that helps companies stop treating hybrid work as a quick fix and trying to move towards a more inclusive, future-proof way of work. Because I think, for lack of a better term, we were forced into a remote work experiment about 5 years ago today at the time of this recording. And a lot of companies were kind of forced to figure out, how do we make work? And now 5 years in, as we're seeing, return to office mandates and, really staunch supporters of remote work, and these kind of two very, very binary camps of how we should be approaching work are still very rooted in location. Whereas you and I both know this as somebody who's based in Spain, in my case, and in your case in Lisbon. Our world is global, right? And so we're just trying to figure out how to help organizations design for that full spectrum of hybrid, because hybrid work is not a strategy. It is that spectrum of possibility. And so whether that's remote, hybrid, in office, whatever combination works for your teams, you really want to be in that position of trying to address, how do I make work for my people and make people work as one no matter where they are? So that's what we do, and it's exciting.
Cool. Why did you call hybrid work a quick fix? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so what I found was, and this is something that it was starting to frustrate me with the team, because we saw when hybrid work emerged as this perfect panacea when offices started to open up again, as, all right, what if we have the best of both worlds? Obviously, we saw people work in an office and then they were all forced out of it. And then we saw how they made remote work when they were working from homes or wherever they were. Why don't we give them the best of both worlds? And that sounded on paper like this really great idea. Oh, cool. 2 days in an office, 3 days at home. You don't have to worry about those long commutes. You get the best of both worlds. Clearly, we're seeing that the actual kind of rollout of that has not been as effective as we would have liked. And if anything, some of the companies that swore, oh, you'll never have to worry about lack of flexibility here, we'll always support your decision to work remotely, are starting to move actually more back towards that 5, even 4 days in an office and maybe 1 day at home version of hybrid. So that's what I mean by a quick fix. It was just kind of thrown together as we're still depending on people coming into an office headquarters and not really thinking strategically about other ways that we can design work.
Okay. So then what are, in your opinion, the biggest challenges that companies are facing when trying to implement full remote or hybrid?
So I think a big part is, you're looking at lack of engagement. I think that's a big one. You're looking at people who are not in the current version of hybrid, say, for example, 3 days a week or 4 days a week in the office and one at home, really getting the best of both worlds, or the people who are, forced into an office are finding that they're on Zoom or Teams calls all day when they're like, wait, why did I commute for 2 hours? Why did I leave my children at home? Why have I spent however much on gasoline or transport to get here? And I'm just, I've been told that this is where I'm going to come to collaborate, and I'm not working with any of my team members. And so there's just been a lot of, that's a huge part. We're also seeing high turnover in places that don't implement it right. And really just confusion from people who are like, what am I supposed to be doing here? Who am I supposed to be meeting? I was told that I'm supposed to come into an office to network, to learn from my manager if I'm a new joiner, but I'm not seeing that actually translate into the type of connection or even the type of collaboration I was promised. And so you're seeing a lot of just confusion in general in terms of implementation. And that's leading to a lot of missed possibilities for companies to design work better.
I guess that there's no perfect solution for that. You need then to look at what's happening in the company and try to design something that would work.
So what we actually have found is that, when we're looking at remote and return to office as kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, there's so much space in between. So when I say spectrum, we've literally determined that hybrid in its current iteration is only one version of work somewhere between remote and return to office, which is there's actually 12 different distinct work models.
12.
There's 12. Yeah. There are a lot of great companies that are doing great work on this, but you don't hear that, unfortunately, in the kind of noise of the return to office mandates and those headlines.
Did you create those 12, or it's based on literature, or?
It's based on literature research and our own work with clients. And so we were just trying to catalog that. It started actually back in 2022. We saw a KPMG article, which I'm happy to link or send across to you, that was starting to document the different versions of hybrid work that they were seeing. And so we'd see, for example, fully virtual, but 3 quarterly meetups a year for the entire company. Or you would see a version that was asynchronous first, but still required, at least on the team level, that the manager had a stipend for folks to come into the office on their team, say, for example, 2 weeks every quarter, and they could distribute that as they saw fit. You saw some versions of this that were very much team and department oriented versus maybe a smaller company, say 500 to 1,000 people, had the ability to plan their entire year around, okay, when are we going to see each other as an entire company these 2 times of the year? And they plan their entire calendar around it. So all these different versions of distributed work, we've actually put together an ebook, and we're breaking it down in episodes of our podcast, Inclusion in Progress. And we're showcasing each of these 12 models that we've studied and seen that companies are really innovating on. So it's very exciting.
The link is in the description of the video, the link for the ebook. Okay, so if anyone is interested, you could click there. Okay. And now I'm also curious, because I was not aware that we could have those 12 different work models. But basically, I think I see that from, like, you have the extremes, and then you have different graduations of either remote or either in office, which would make a different kind of work environment. Okay. If I'm listening to this video right now and I'm trying to think which model would be the perfect for my company, even if I'm like the leader of a company or manager or an HR person, what is the best way for me to assess? Okay.
Absolutely. Well, we use something which we call our inclusive distributed work framework. And so we're looking to help companies measure and optimize for 3 things to determine their best fit distributed work model.
3 things.
And it's easy to remember, thankfully. It's 3 Fs. It's fairness, flexibility, and flow. And so those 3 pillars are what make our inclusive distributed work, work. That's a lot of work in one sentence, but there you are. And so we first ask companies to look at, that fairness lens. Do all employees, regardless of location, have equal access to career opportunities, leadership visibility, the resources that they need to do work from wherever they're working? Or is there maybe an in-office bias that favors certain workers over others?
That's very important.
very, very important for sure. We actually have a whole podcast episode just on hidden biases of remote work. So it's interesting. You think, oh, it's remote, it's egalitarian. Not quite in practice, right? So we first look at fairness. The second is flexibility. I mean, we've talked about it a little bit already just now, but we're looking specifically at policies and whether or not they're designed to support different work styles, different time zones. You and I are on the same peninsula, but we're a time zone apart, right? But for folks who are, say, for example, 6, 7, or 8 hours apart, life circumstances, if you're a caregiver or if you're somebody who's living with roommates, whatever that looks like, are policies currently in your company designed to support flexible work? Or are they just a hybrid work mandate in disguise? And so we're thinking about flexibility through the lens of not just remote versus in office, as I've said, but choice, autonomy, the ability to determine your work schedule and continue to perform at your best no matter where you are. And the third and final one is flow, because obviously nothing works in isolation. You are looking at, can teams collaborate effectively across geographies, cultures, neurodiverse needs? Or are you looking at, certain processes aren't in alignment and that's slowing people down? And so you're looking at how do you make distributed work, whatever version of it you're implementing, feel seamless, and so that teams can actually do their best work without any bottlenecks or burnout. And so looking at those three different lenses is how we then come to determine, okay, what are the things that we need to first set up to help make sure your organization can make distributed work for you, and then determine what the best distributed work model that works for your company. Maybe it's several models depending on how your company is structured, and then we work from there. So
inside the company, there may be different models depending on how teams work. Okay.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know about you, but I do a lot of work in tech, and it's kind of close to home because my husband is in IT. And I know for a fact that the entire pandemic, they never turned their cameras on, right? And they can work quite independently. But a sales team, for example, needs that time in office. And so they need a version of a distributed work model that encourages at least, whether maybe it's a closer version to the version of hybrid that we're seeing in companies today. And that can change over time depending on how the team looks like and how the company's needs change, how budgets change. But you're really trying to look at how do you apply that specifically every quarter, every 6 months. You kind of look back and see, is this working for what our team needs? And if so, how can we scale on that? And if not, how can we readjust?
What happens to the F of fairness in a company where some teams can be fully remote, other teams need to be linked to an office?
So that's the challenge, right? So we look at things such as a big thing that we keep hearing is, especially for new joiners, folks who are maybe earlier in career, who are looking for just the chance to network with their managers or even their colleagues, to have what I call the swivel in the chair moment. So maybe for that time period, at least, when you do know that you're going to be hiring several folks on your team adjusts slightly their schedules, or the manager or a couple of senior people on that team adjust slightly to cater to making sure that those newer joiners have the access to knowing who's there. I think it's really just a matter of, are we giving the teams that dynamism to be able to make those choices? And if we're not able to do that, what are the things that we can do to make sure that the onboarding process is much more agile for newer joiners, to give them the access to rooms and resources that wouldn't prohibit them, or rather that wouldn't favor an in-office bias, instead of them getting access to being able to talk to those folks that they need to move forward. I mean, another thing that often comes up when we're talking to folks is, how do we actually implement, what does in-person look like for us? How frequent does that need to be? And that is a lot of trial and error, we found. Like I said, it could be department related. It could be industry related. For example, what a finance team needs versus what a tech team needs versus what an NGO might need is going to look very different. But with a hypothesis, and then figuring out how can we pilot that first in, say, one team, and then from there take those results and see if that's applicable to the rest of the other departments or the rest of the other teams in that department, and working out from there.
So you mentioned trial and error, which is perfectly natural. So there is no literature, there's no historical record for anything like this, right? So many of us are figuring out along the way as it goes.
Exactly. We have to give ourselves grace, right, João?
Right.
Yeah.
So you already mentioned this twice. And so I was saving the question for later on, but since you already mentioned, because, I love remote work. And the reasons are because of the time that you save, not commuting, etc. You can convert that time into family time, etc. But I'm very skeptical of what remote work does to people that are starting their careers. Indeed, when you are an intern, when you are learning, right? Because my days, your days, probably you had to start working in companies, shadowing people, seeing the office dynamics, the power struggles of the internal politics work, right? And just being there and absorbing everything that happens within the work environment. I haven't yet found an answer for this, but I don't understand how these learnings that I just mentioned exist with remote work.
Yeah, I know. And that's the big question mark, right? And so and that's why I really hope that if people take nothing else away from this conversation, they have to remember that remote and return to office, or it's a false binary, it's a false choice. Because even for the fully remote people, what we found is when we have been studying these different models and implementing them with clients, taking on interviews for different case studies that we're putting together, we find that the folks that you would think, oh, they've been doing remote work prior to the pandemic, over even 10, 12 years before the pandemic. And they still value in person. They still see the value in, even prior to implementing all the asynchronous workflows and getting all the tech to work, they know that they need to make sure that, especially every new person who joins the team, and even the boosts in engagement that they see from folks when they have those in-person opportunities, are such a critical part of not just company culture, but knowledge transfer, as you mentioned. And so anybody who kind of dials all in and says it's remote or nothing, no, I encourage you to move away from that idea, because there is still value. If some of the companies that have been innovating on this, that we've studied, that are part of our 12 distributed work models, are telling you that it's still important for us to have in-person time, because they see the value in that question of how do we make sure that our teams feel connected. They know there's nothing that compares to in person. So it's less about, do we all have to get together in an office? That kind of is prohibitive and not inclusive. So a lot of folks, for example, in big hubs like San Francisco or New York or London, moved way far away during the pandemic. Naturally, they're like, oh, cool, I don't have to be tied to a city anymore.
They change their lives under the impression that they could do that freely without problems. They could work remotely, right? And then they are surprised with get back to office, or you lose your job.
And it feels like a big, the rug's pulled out from under you after something's been promised to you, right? That feels really, and that can breed a lot of resentment if you're doing it from the place of, oh, we just did better when we were in the office, or collaboration automatically happens when we're in an office. And again, that's going back to the other binary.
Right.
You need to find whatever medium somewhere on that spectrum that works for you. And I stress again, hybrid work, or however you call it, is not a strategy. It is a spectrum. Figuring out what that spectrum is for you and your teams, that isn't reliant upon location first, but more on the humans that are working on your teams and how to get them to collaborate better. You break away from this box of everybody needs to go into a headquarters, and all of a sudden there's a world of possibilities for you.
So now that the talent is truly global, we have companies that are completely distributed. So going back to an office is not even on their radar, because there's not even an office sometimes.
Exactly. There's no office to come back to. Yes.
There's nowhere else to go. But those companies still struggle with onboardings, interns, etc. So how do we apply everything that we said it is important for the majority of the companies in companies that are truly remote?
Exactly. And so again, it's being very strategic, right? I think there are some really great people teams, people operations teams, HR business partners that we know are doing great work on this. And a lot of them are actually open sourcing their company culture handbooks and their onboarding handbooks. and showcasing how they make sure that from day one, no matter where you're working from, as long as you've been hired by this company and you're getting a salary from them, that you feel absolutely connected. And what they found, as they are, again, approaching it with a rigorous data mind that I love, they're also showcasing the fact that, yes, during this onboarding process, this can happen virtually, but there needs to be some touch point somewhere. And that touch point, again, so there's one of the models that we also refer to. It is asynchronous, but because there's so many different places in the world where teams are gathered, they look globally across where their teams are scattered, and they're like, okay, maybe we don't need a huge office in this area, but we can offer a co-working space that people who are around this area can come to, and just pay a membership for them to come in. That would be a great example of a place where an intern or somebody who is newer could come in, because they know that there's a hub there. It's not a full-blown office, but it's a hub where they know they'll find their people, or they'll find people that work in their company. And so there's, again, like I said, location can look different for different places. It doesn't have to be this huge high rise or nothing. That would be an example of a place where, in addition to the virtual channel, you also have an in-person element, and it could be just at a smaller scale.
Because I guess the view that I still have on remote work is very framed to, or very biased to, seniority. Because, and what I mean by that, okay, is that when companies hire, they need to hire people that are senior enough and professional to work remotely without anyone around them to help. So they need to figure out the solutions by themselves and be professional to deliver as expected, because the same way there's no one around them to micromanage, to really see, is this guy working or not? Is he on social media all the time? He may be, but if the person is delivering as expected, that may be fine, right? Or the person may be working from the beach, traveling the world and working at the same time. But if it's delivering, that's fine. So, but if in order for that to happen, that criteria needs to be, the person needs to be senior, right? Needs to find the solutions for themselves. So it's still very difficult to, in my view, to open fully remote to really everyone and give proper entry points for people in their careers if there is no way to help them on those early years. Okay.
Yeah, and again, like we said, there is no solution that has presented itself as the panacea. What we're seeing is that companies are just approaching it in different ways depending on what their workforce needs. But I agree with you, absolutely. There, especially for newer folks, and at least I don't know what it's like in Portugal, but in the US, we're starting to see at the older end of the spectrum, folks that were retired who want to come back to the office or want to come back to work, that they also benefit from flexible work and whatever that looks like for their companies. And so you've got these two ends of the spectrum that also still value in person. And I know it sounds kind of like, what, Gen Z are like the most connected generation ever. No, actually studies show that they benefit from and crave the access to folks in person in a way that, say, for example, people in the middle will say millennials, Gen Xers, kind of early baby boomers are maybe a little bit more reticent to want to come into the office because of different life obligations. Those are still folks that you have to cater for. And so how you design that, like I said, all we can guide you on, at least from our perspective, is what model works best for you, what models, depending on the makeups of your teams. If they skew younger, then obviously you have to have maybe more of an in-person element, and you have to figure out what works for you. But it's approaching it from that lens of creativity, but rather than I have to box somebody in based off of these two separate choices and taking it from there. There is nothing that replaces in person for sure, but what version of that in your definition of hybrid or distributed is up to you to figure out.
Okay. Because you are very feet on the ground on this topic, I would like to ask your help to go back a little bit my memory lane on remote work. So if we go back some years, we were during the pandemic, everyone was working from home. The world found a way to adapt to the reality, especially using technology like Zoom, etc. And somehow it seems like it worked, right? Or people or the companies were even more productive somehow. We heard about that. But then the pandemic stopped and we started seeing those move back to the office movements. What happened, Kay? If everything was working, why did companies started to ask people to come back? And allow me just to add one more thing. Is it because this may be a cultural thing or not, but you tell me, is it because people, when they are working remotely, companies know that they are not performing 100% of the time, and somehow they want to keep that control over employees?
I think with that last part, you hit the nail on the head. It's a control issue. It's not Katarina Berg of Spotify famously said, you can't hire adults and then expect to treat them like children. You're supposed to be hiring folks who, again, we have proof, we have evidence, we have data that show that people were productive and show that they could be productive during a pandemic. When the world felt like it was falling apart for a lot of people, we made it work. And we didn't have the fancy setups that we do now, right? And we didn't have the data points that we do now on how to make remote work better.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, the return to office mandates that are kind of, we're seeing the JP Morgans, the Amazons, some of these larger companies moving back towards or trying to push for a 5-day
and everyone
work
following, right?
And everyone following because, we're all sheep. We're being led from one side.
We can do the same, right? It's like firing and...
Yeah. And again, it's that false binary, right? But I think it comes down to the thing that strikes me, and this is a conversation I have often with my team, is the same folks who said, yeah, remote work, it's the future, are the very same people who are saying, no, we need you back in the office now.
So what happened in their minds?
In their minds, obviously, a big part has to do with the fact that control, like they're seeing things through the lens of, okay, it works better for me, or it worked better for me, and my profit margins I thought worked better for me when I saw all my people in the office. That's a style of leadership that, again, is very much rooted in a cultural lens of, weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and developed nations. That lens of they probably went to the same type of university or they worked around headquarters in some of the bigger cities. So they know, through the lens of what you were saying about, oh, I can't understand how a new joiner or an intern can work their way up in an organization without being seen by someone in person. That's a cultural lens, right? That's a belief of I can only be a leader if my people, I can see them and if I know that they're doing their things well. I think there's also the issue of real estate, right? Those are some huge, huge contracts that, again, we've seen the fallout from some of the largest cities where, especially, I can tell you, I'm from Los Angeles originally, but I have tons of family in San Francisco. Lots of clients come through or are from San Francisco. The city's completely different now because even though almost all the major tech companies had a headquarters in the city, almost nobody comes into the city now to work full time. So that changes the landscape of things. So of course, those leaders are like, well, what are we doing with all this empty space? We can't get out of these contracts. People need to get into the office and use them. So that's another part of it. I think another huge paradigm shift, honestly, has to do with the fact that it's the assumption of the version of work and the version of leadership that I know how to run a company with is dying. And so moving people back into the office gives you that sense of everything else feels a little bit too scattered unless I see you here. And this is what I know, which is the office paradigm, the me seeing you, the thinking that collaboration happens better when people are in office. And so I think that all of those things, and again, I'm not speaking to those leaders every day. I tend to focus on folks who are a little bit more proactive on designing distributed work. But that's what I'm seeing is happening in a lot of companies, and that's what I suspect is happening. Again, the challenge here is, how do we move away from that binary? Because that's a false choice. Whereas like a big one is, collaboration happens better in an office. Around what water cooler? I don't know about you, João, but when I had to go into an office every day, I didn't hang around the water cooler and hope to network with somebody, right? A perfect example of how kind of lazy these mandates were from this idea of I just want folks to be back into the office is now you're seeing, like Amazon, I remember, said January 1st, 2025, everybody comes into the office or you're out. And everybody came into the office who wanted to stay, and there wasn't enough space, right? And so they had to move it back to this month. And so it just goes to show you that I'm not sure, even though the data shows that, it's actually 14% longer hiring times for people if there's no flexibility, and a 23% higher turnover compared to, folks who have access to flexibility versus are being forced fully in office. These mandates are actually showing they're being studied now. These data points come from the University of Pittsburgh from a colleague that I know named Mark Ma, and for a fact that even with this data, CEOs are leading from a place of a knee-jerk reaction, from a more, I would sadly say, emotional place than a data-driven one. So I'm not in their shoes, so I don't know. These are all my speculations, but that's what I'm seeing.
What's your bet for the next years? Will remote work continue to shrink with the go back to offices, or we'll find a perfect balance between companies that need to be in office, companies that can be totally remote, and some of them in between, especially if you're trying to plan your career, right? So I want to be a complete remote person that travels the world and work at the same time, or do I need to prepare myself to go back to office and have that office life?
I think the reality is trends come and go. You and I both know this. We've seen different cycles.
Remote is a trend? That's what you're saying, Kay?
Close. You almost got me there. No, but in terms of, the way that we approach work, like, so for example, return to office, you yourself said, all these people all of a sudden are now like pushing for back to in office, or hybrid is no longer folks that said that they were like, oh, we're never going to use our office spaces again, all of a sudden are asking people to come back in. That's a trend, right? But what isn't trending is employees' desire for flexibility and autonomy. They've had a taste of it. It's not going to go away. Mm-hmm. Especially folks who are, we'll say, maybe company agnostic now. There's maybe more focus on what can I get from my career in terms of my own personal values, mission, my ability to start a family, or whatever my particular me as an individual wants from a company, and less so about, oh, I want to stay at this company for 20, 30 years. Like, those days are gone. So how do you hold on to people? Well, you're looking at, how do I offer them flexibility, autonomy? How do I give them the opportunity to even maybe say, go from one department to the other, skill share, try a different aspect of supporting my company? You're looking at just approaching work through a different lens, and that could happen with or without an office. We have tools that have evolved way better than the early days when everybody's using Zoom and it crashed, or the bandwidth of, say, for example, VPNs maybe couldn't support folks working remotely the way that they do now. I don't think it'll go away, but what I think will go away is this idea of this binary. And I can tell you it'll go away because we're working with and talking to companies every day that don't believe in that binary and are figuring out their version of distributed work. Mm-hmm. And honestly, prior to the pandemic, you and I are examples of this. We work with people from all over the world all the time. Mm-hmm. Distributed work always was a thing, right? I'm not going to fly across the world just to shake somebody's hand for a meeting. There's Zoom for that, or there's Teams for that. Mm-hmm. Folks who are from countries that tend to be overlooked, or are not traditionally hired at the talent level, are not going to all of a sudden be flown into an office. Or, we were working with a company that they were based in the East Coast of the US, and during the pandemic, they hired a bunch of folks out of Costa Rica because they were on the same time zone. They spoke good enough English, and they ended up being huge members of the team. If they decided all of a sudden to force a return to office, what are all those valued members of the team going to do? Right. And so we're seeing versions of folks who are already extending upon and innovating upon the version of work that was already here. Okay. That we're all living as global teams and global citizens. But this, I think RTOs may be a temporary blip.
Maybe offering the possibility for you to work remotely as an employee will become, from an employer value proposition, will become a benefit that certain companies would provide you. Besides salary, besides other benefits. So here we also offer you that flexibility. And exactly. that may weight more or less when you're accepting an offer to change a company.
I mean, folks care, there's a lot of studies on this that I'm not going to be able to quote off the top of my head right now, but that are showcasing how folks are willing to take a salary cut if they have more hours to work flexibly. You can't just throw more money at a person anymore necessarily. That's a trend that I would say would continue. And so HR teams specifically and people teams specifically, leadership teams who are considering how to make their employee value proposition better and their employer brand better, that's something you're always going to have to consider and revisit regularly. And that's not going to change.
One important aspect when working remotely is when you also keep some importance and focus on DEI initiatives. I know that you also help companies doing that. So how do you assess an organization's current DEI landscape, especially in remote?
Yeah, so diversity, equity, and inclusion has been a very, again, we're diving into the heavy hitters today.
What else?
I know, right? We're throwing them all in there.
That's on the title of the video. Those are the keywords, right?
Exactly.
People click just to hear about that.
I know. Oh man, that could be a whole other episode. But for now, what I will say is that the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion has been such an interesting bellwether of how companies are approaching the natural, not just globalization, but also demographic changes in our workforce. We saw the sort of pendulum swing towards we have to kind of fix how we do inclusion or anything that is perceived to be DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, whatever you decided to call it internally. And now we're seeing the pendulum swing back towards a more compliance-based lens. The way that we've approached it, or the way that we are encouraging folks to continue to have that conversation, but through the lens of distributed work, is, again, fairness, flexibility, and flow. Are your folks able to work well wherever they are? Do they have access to the right things and the right work setup if they do choose to work from home? Or do they have access to an office space where it's accessible for them if they're a person who has those needs? That's the lens of inclusion, but through the lens of wherever they work, they should be empowered to do their best work. Flexibility, again, you want to treat your folks as adults who are capable of doing their job. I mean, I know very few people who, aside from maybe I need to hop to a doctor's appointment here, or I need to pick up my child early from school pickup because, my partner can't, or the traffic's crazy, that doesn't find a way to make that up later. I don't know that this kind of stereotypical idea of, oh, we're all like we're all on our computers at home, like doing laundry and like on social media. Like I know very few people in real life. I don't know if that's a stereotype somewhere else in the world, but I know very few people in real life that value their jobs so little that they think, oh, my husband and I actually work more from home than maybe we would have in an office, because you'd have the coffee breaks and the swivel in the chair moments or the impromptu meetings, which I know there's value in. But, the ability to actually see, like, are we including those folks who are in the office and outside of the office and somewhere in between? That's something that, again, you're looking at that through the lens of, am I empowering flexibility for my team members? And is that designed for inclusion for all those team members wherever they are? And then those workflows, again, like you can't work unless people can work with each other. And so how does that happen? Asynchronously, synchronously, the platforms that you have, are they secure? Do they have access to all of those things when they're working from home to be able to do their job well? And so we're still measuring all of those things, but naturally what bubbles up to the surface is the issue of, okay, DEI maybe as the broader lens, where however you feel when you hear about those words or that acronym together currently today. I mean, who knows what it'll feel like about it tomorrow. But what it comes down to at the end of the day is an evidence-based process system to figure out, how do we make sure that all of our team members have what they need to perform at their best and collaborate well with each other. That's it.
Okay.
And regardless of what your entry point is into that conversation, that's something I think we can all agree on regardless. Mm-hmm. We just so happen to do it through the lens of distributed work.
some minutes ago, I was laughing internally and I didn't want to interrupt you because you reminded me a meme that is circling around, which is someone saying, I took a remote job because I wanted to work only eight hours per day. And then the meme changed and it says, now I work 24/7 because
now I work 24/7. I'm never disconnected.
there's no boundary between personal life and work life. It's calls at any time. It's you work with people from all over the world messaging you during your nighttime, etc. I know this is like joking because we can set up notifications to be muted from certain hours, etc. But it's exactly the feeling that you may, if you're not careful in setting up your life, work life, it could be that the feeling, indeed.
And that then leads to that next question, right? Naturally, of okay, if we're thinking about inclusion for this conversation, well, we then move away from that binary topic of location of fully remote or fully in office, because regardless, work needs to get done. So maybe the better question I should be asking is, how can I get work to get done better? And how can I empower my team members with the ability to set those boundaries? Because bottlenecks and burnout are two huge things that we're still troubleshooting in distributed work. So when we're looking at it through the lens of inclusion, how do I help you set up better work-life boundaries? How do I teach you how to set up notifications? How do I help you work with AI to help your workflows work better so that you can, have a second brain with you essentially while you're going through your list of topics for the day so that your brain isn't as burnt out when you need to disconnect. Those are things that we're also thinking of when we're setting up the distributed work models. How do we upskill our people to do their work better? And that needs to happen regardless of location as a conversation and at a policy level, a protocol level, and at a people level.
So the focus seems to be very much on optimal performance. What people need to have their best performance while at work, right? But you mentioned some minutes ago that nowadays DEI is more on the compliance side. Not sure what you meant by that, and I was holding the question here because, and let me be very open with you. The idea that I had before our conversation about DEI is that, and especially because you mentioned compliance, right? I had maybe an incorrect idea that the big focus or the main focus would be to make sure that on your workforce you had all the diversity possible when it comes to different races, ethnicities, disabled people, different sexual orientation, and the company had processes, especially in recruitment, etc., to make sure that everyone was represented in the best way possible, right? And I assume that would be compliance with some kind of regulation or law, mainly in the US. Is this still a reality?
Yeah, and so that's a really great question. And the reason I say DEI, unfortunately, has fallen into these two, again, pendulum swings, binaries. We see them all the time, right? So there is that kind of mosaic colors of the rainbow idea that you're referring to of what I think most people assume that DEI meant at a company level. And that's what my colleague and friend, Dr. Jonathan Ashton-Lamptey, would refer to as the flags, food, and fun version of DEI, where you're in the brochures and showcasing that you have all the people there all happy and singing Kumbaya. That's not necessarily the most effective version of it either. But again, that was a compliance-driven thing. It was look, we're doing what needs to be done, even if it's visually, to showcase that we're committed to this. The other side of the spectrum is, and this is maybe a history lesson for folks who maybe have heard of the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation from afar and seen how it's overtaken the globe. It's very much rooted in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, especially the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and all of his people, his activists who partnered with JFK at the federal level to figure out how they can remove discrimination towards historically excluded or underrepresented or marginalized groups. And it's enshrouded in law. And so then it became a thing of, okay, when you're hiring folks, as you and I know, we tend to hire people because we're all biased that look, think, and come from similar backgrounds to us because we can relate to them. And so this was at the federal level through the EEOC, which was the name of the act that then became the basis for DEI as we know it today. that was at the federal level requiring companies, the same way affirmative action in the universities in the US required universities to make sure that certain people who came from these groups who are encoded in law had access to these rooms and resources that they hadn't had otherwise.
Okay.
And that's how that kind of then spiraled into this idea of DEI is the representation of these different groups and making sure we have all of them in the room. It's not a wrong approach, but I think it doesn't meet the moment for where our world is at. And then when you take that conversation out of a US context, in the US context, I can say as an American, it's already quite problematic. But you take it out of that context and try to apply it globally, and it can be confusing for people. I've been in a lot of those conversations myself, and it's like, how do I explain to somebody who is from a traditional Roma background that their version of what they call racism is the same as, or different from, same as but different from somebody who is Black American? I'm not equipped to have those conversations. I don't have either of those lived experiences. But that's what, and unfortunately, it devolved into, rather than seeing it for the work that it was doing, which was that systems and processes basis of work that it should have been.
Okay.
It got a little lost. I think it'll find its way back. How it will look like or what it will be called, I don't know.
And right now, okay, did you see or are you seeing changes, especially after the last U.S. elections?
Absolutely, for sure. I think it's
in what?
I would see it in the way that DEI has unfortunately become, depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on, an indicator of tribalism, really. And so that unfortunately has distracted from the good of the work that can be done in organizations when it's implemented well. So that means that, again, meeting compliance, especially at the legal level, as certain things are being instituted to make sure that DEI in its current form is no longer in place, folks are continuing to try to figure out how to do that work, because you still want to hire, for example, more women in tech. You still want to hire folks from underprivileged backgrounds to take on internships at your organization, because that's where you are in that part of the country or that part of the world. But you have to be creative in how you phrase it now. And it's now getting lost in semantics instead of it getting the progress being implemented. And so I'm seeing, unfortunately, a lot of that. Like, the work is still continuing. It's just how people are kind of adjusting how they talk about it inside companies to make sure that it continues to happen.
Okay. You're very passionate in talking about these topics. Was that the drive behind you creating a podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I like to talk. I figured I might as well get my words out there now. What I found was, so in the world of work, I mean, for me, it was that my passion for this work is obviously personal. I have never necessarily been seen as a person who would be in those rooms traditionally of say boardrooms or on company boards. And so I have deep, not just empathy, but also lived experience that I can relate to when I speak to folks who are from countries that tend to be overlooked traditionally, are neurodivergent like myself, experienced burnout like myself. You know, back in my early 20s, I burnt out of my first corporate job, landed in the hospital, and spent 2 years in recovery. And so I knew that it wasn't necessarily me, it was the way that work was designed. And that kind of story of what if work was designed better so that more of us could express our full potential. And I landed in Spain about 15 years ago now at the time of this recording.
Oh.
I know, it's been a while. And, you know, as an immigrant, like my parents are immigrants as well from the Philippines, you know, I was also a non-EU citizen, which meant I had to be creative in how I got work. And so I began my freelance career, not thinking it would be more than just to build a portfolio to apply to a master's degree. And that ended up becoming my full-time gig. And that was my first taste of distributed work, because I knew that it gave me the flexibility to manage my mental health. It helped me choose how I worked. And it helped me build a career that was truly global on my own terms. And now, flash forward to today, our company now advises organizations like LinkedIn, like Meta, the IMF, and we're working across cultures and time zones ourselves. And I know that wouldn't have happened maybe necessarily at as quickly or at the same level of impact that I feel like we're currently having if I'd gone up a traditional corporate ladder in the way that it was currently structured. This isn't to say I'm anti-corporate, right? So I very much, that's why we work with folks from those companies, because I think work can be reimagined and redesigned to fit the version of worker that we currently have entering the office, in the office, working alongside one another. And that can be across time, space, technology, versions of technology we don't even know we're going to unlock, like AI is a huge one. And it helps leaders move beyond this idea of workplace assumptions and designing work that actually works for everyone. And that's what I'm really committed to trying to illuminate in our podcast.
And that commitment and passion already generated 134 episodes.
Here we are.
So I have the link in the video description for Spotify, at least. So anyone interested in getting to know more or hear more about Kay, so don't forget to subscribe that, click and follow that.
Okay. Absolutely.
Kay, we are close to the end. And the last thing that I wanted to ask you, first of all, thank you for everything that you shared and the light that you gave on these topics from a different perspective. So it's not just remote work as we've heard many times, and especially on this podcast, but the different view between hybrid, remote, whatever works best. Thank you for that. And what I normally ask in the end to everyone that comes into the show is if they could recommend me someone that has an interesting story, project, profile that could be an excellent next guest for the show. Who would you like to recommend?
Well, a fellow podcaster, and I mentioned him already, Dr. Jonathan Ashton-Lamptey of Element of Inclusion. I think the work that he's doing around making the inclusion conversation more accessible, I scratched the surface a little bit in our conversation today, but he's made it not just accessible, but also global. And I think he's doing amazing things.
Challenge accepted. Thank you very much, Kay. And who knows, we are so close to each other, apparently. So maybe one day we find ourselves in person.
I'm overdue for a pastéis de nata, so one day soon.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your day.
All right, thanks. I'll talk to you soon.